Hello and welcome to another episode of the djproject Criterion Collection. And we're dealing with a big one. We're dealing with Spine 185, The Adventures of Antoine Doinel. This is another box set. What they all have, these are all the films that are directed by François Truffaut, and they deal with a character of his own creation, Antoine Doinel. All right, I guess before I get into this, Truffaut is a polarizing figure. I mean, I think a lot of the directors that come out of the French New Wave are polarizing in another way, but Truffaut is polarizing in a completely different respect. Whereas the worst thing that you can dish out about Godard is that he's a self-indulgent experimentalist. The thing you can accuse of Truffaut of doing as someone who starts off kind of radical but then ends up making the same types of films that he went against. And I think that's an unfair generalization to make. I think what may put off people with Truffaut in the beginning, and I would say this was kind of me, for instance, is that because he was willing to work with conventional stories, and he was very much a classicist in terms of his cinema. But I think what Truffaut was interested in was expanding the possibilities within that realm. I mean, I talk a lot about expanding possibilities, and there's of course expanding possibilities in the greater world of cinema. And which means that you don't think just in terms of narrative, you think of other things. That's where you get into people like Stan Brakhage. But you can also expand the possibilities within a certain realm of cinema, like narrative cinema. And I feel that that's where Truffaut really shines on his own. He doesn't need to be a relentless experimenter in the same way that Godard did, and to some extent still does. For him, it's all motivated by the story. Any kind of innovation, any kind of different way of doing things, it's all done in the service of the story, not just doing it for the sake of doing it. So while Truffaut may not be overtly the most audacious experimenter as Godard was in the 60s, it certainly doesn't make his films any less interesting. And I think seeing the Antoine Doinel films is a really good case for that. So, with that in mind, let's go into the films, which means we finally get to talk about a film that I alluded to much earlier, The 400 Blows. Now, in terms of spine numbers, this is actually spine number 5. So yes, so technically I'm going out of order, but like I said before, I count box sets as one purchase because that's actually how you purchase it. You don't purchase it piecemeal; you purchase it as one whole thing. It just happens to include spine number 5. And actually, this is a title that you can get on its own. You don't need to get the box set in order to get this. Very quick history lesson as far as the history of 400 Blows in relation to Criterion. There was a Laserdisc edition, and in the early days of DVDs, it was a port over from their Laserdisc onto DVD. They had lost the rights. They had to quickly discontinue it because they lost the rights to the 400 Blows. Fox Lober, I believe, owned it originally. And then they put off a really bad DVD themselves. And then eventually they were able to get the rights back. And furthermore, they were able to get the rights to the other Antoine Doinel films. And so they initially remastered it for their for that package. So there was a spell from, I think this came out in 2003. Yeah, this came out in 2003. I think from 2003 to about 2005 or 2006, I think. That was the only way you can get 400 Blows, was actually getting the set. Now, it's, but since 2005 or 2006, it was a standalone DVD release. And then later it was issued out on Blu-ray. So you can get this title on its own. But the reason why it's part of this box set is because this deals with Antoine Doinel. 400 Blows is probably the most famous and most well known of Truffaut's films. This was the film that not only started his career but also helped to launch the French New Wave, along with the film that came out next year, Godard's own Breathless, which Truffaut had a hand in writing. So, 400 Blows, what can you say? This is one of those films where you could probably spend a lot of time talking about. But basically what this film covers is Antoine Doinel's childhood. Actually, his beginnings into adolescence. He's, I think he's supposed to be 12 in this story. And he has to deal with all the things that 12-year-olds typically deal with. He has to deal with a school teacher he doesn't like, and dealing with school in general, which he doesn't like. He has to deal with parents who are there's serious mood whiplash in terms of his parents. His mother in general tends to be quite harsh and condescending to him, and his father is that, but only in a very mild way. He seems a bit closer to his father in this than he does to his mother. And Antoine himself is known for taking things, is known for lying, is known for not showing a whole lot of interest in things, except this desire to wanting to live. He has this desire to live out on his own, to live his own life, to live life on his own terms, and to earn his own keep. That's his big ambition. He doesn't like being confined as a son, or as a child. He doesn't like being able to go to school, and so it's just looking at all those things, and what makes this now, the thing with influential films is that there's the initial wave where it shows up and it seems like it breaks new grounds, and then there's the years after. Is the film still relevant and still powerful? Some films age well and some films don't. This is an example of a film that still ages fairly well, and I think because it takes an honest look at childhood, it doesn't go to extremes. It certainly doesn't over sentimentalize it and saying, oh, these were the best years of our lives. It definitely doesn't go down that route. But it also doesn't say that this is the most bleak, oppressive, dismal thing and thank God it's over. It reaches a nice middle ground. Like I said, there's a bit of a mood whiplash. There's at some points when it seems like Antoine Doinel, played by Jean-Pierre Léaud, and this is so not only Truffaut got his start, but Léaud got his start through this film, and then the two almost became inseparable, especially in regards to the character of Antoine Doinel, as you'll see. But anyways, but there are moments when it looks like Antoine seems to be okay. Like there's one moment where he had just written, well, it's established that he doesn't do very well with school, he constantly gets in trouble with his teacher in school. His mother one day, partly because he caught her with another man, it wasn't his father, but also because of this ongoing this ongoing strife between them, she decides to, maybe I should do something different and I should be more encouraging of him. And she has this deal where if your next essay you do really well in it, I'll give you 1,000 francs. And he I don't know if I think his mother encouraged him to do this, but he starts reading Balzac on his own, and and he even makes a little shrine to Balzac with and actually almost burns down his room because he leaves the candle running, going in this little shrine that he makes to him, and. This was after, and actually, on the same day, he writes his essay for class, and he felt like he did a really good job. And because of this, because of all of this, his parents they go out to the movies, they go out to the cinema, and it's really the only time where it's the happiest he is with his parents, and like everybody's getting along. Then comes the next day where the teacher reads his essay first because it was the worst, and it was because in his essay he ends up writing pretty much verbatim a section of Balzac, and so he's accused of plagiarism, even though he didn't have the book in front of him at all. It was just because he read it. He remembered it. It struck a deep chord within him, and then that's what it came out. So it was pure mimicry. It's still, I mean, it's still not his work, but you can't really blame him for mimicking something that good. But of course he gets accused of plagiarism, and this causes more problems with him down the road. So. Again, what makes this film still stand out is again it's the honest look at and particularly with adolescence, and that it's a mixture of things. It's not one way or the other, and this is something that plenty of filmmakers have picked up, and I think that has influenced other films that deal with that subject. Is they try to go for that more nuanced approach and not leaning one way or to the other. There's a lot of memorable shots, including the 2-minute tracking shot where towards the end where Antoine is escaping from the juvenile center, and he's running along the woods, and the camera just constantly tracks on him and follows him along. And then there's the final shot where he reaches the shore, and he runs on the beach, and then he stops at the waves. He turns around, he looks back, and then suddenly there's a freeze frame and an optical zoom into his face, and that's how the film concludes. Very influential shot that have influenced other things. One example of this is in the Beck music video, "Devil's Haircut." It's basically that shot done over and over a couple of times. But at any rate, so yeah, 400 Blues. Trying to think of what else I could say about this. I'll get into this further down the road, but actually 400 Blows has its origins in another film, and that's Zero de Conduite, directed by Jean Vigo. And when I talk about that film, I'll talk about its influence. And that film influenced not only 400 Blows, but also Lindsay Anderson's If, another film that I'll talk about further down the road. But yeah, but actually I think this is going to be the characteristic of all the Antoine Doinel films. I think what makes the Antoine Doinel films really interesting is that this may be the only, well, okay, I know about James Bond, but this may be one of the few character-driven franchises that you can find in film, and certainly this is an auteur franchise. I mean, this character is a creation of François Truffaut. It's a character that he explored cinematically, and actually seeing the films really does give you a window. It does serve as a kind of parallel for his own career, what he was interested in at the time, what he was capable of doing at the time, and where he was at a certain point. So in a way, if you want to know kind of what Truffaut is about, it really is the best single place to go to, and you kind of get a really good sense of what his career was and who he was as a filmmaker. And also as a good example of just character study. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Anyways, now the thing, and as I said before, you can get 400 Blows on its own, but the thing about it is that if you get it on its own, it does not include another Antoine Doinel film that's actually a short, and that is Antoine and Colette. Sorry, Antoine and Colette, and that was released in. By the way, 400 Blows was released in 1959. Antoine and Colette was released in 1962. In fact, it was a short that was part of a larger omnibus film put out by Fox called Love at 20. These are 5 short films made by 5 different directors. Truffaut is one of them. Andrzej Wajda from Poland was another one. I forget the other 3. One was from Italy, another one was from Japan, and forget what the other one was located. But anyways, so the omnibus film is these are just basically little love stories that are, they're just little love stories. And so in this case, this Truffaut decides to look at Truffaut shows the Antoine Doinel character again, except a little bit later in his life, and he's 17 in this story, and he finally makes it after some turbulence, some additional off-screen turbulence. He finally gets into a position where he's out on his own, and he's working for Philips. He's working in the record company. He's working there, and he's earning his own keep, and this allows him to, because of his job and such, he attends youth concerts. And one such concert, he sees this woman named Colette, who's also a student, and this starts a kind of love chase that doesn't end up going very well for him. He tries, like at one point, like once he knows where she lives, he ends up meeting her parents, and he strikes a rapport with them. And actually that's one of the characteristics of Antoine is that he falls in love with a woman. He also falls in love with her family. This being that it's a surrogate for his own family, because he's completely disowned his parents. He wants to have a substitute, so he does this through the woman he loves, which creates its own complications. But anyway, so basically, in a nutshell, it doesn't really work. And in fact, that's actually this is why I can say that Truffaut is not. He's often accused of as being sentimental, like, oh, he just likes making sentimental films. That's not at all sentimental. In fact, if anything, it's heartbreaking to end a film like that, where you don't end up with the girl in the end. In fact, what happens is one evening where he's having dinner with Colette and her parents, Albert shows with whom she's dating. He shows up and they go off, and so in the end, Antoine and Colette's parents are watching television together, the concert that he wanted to take Colette out to go see. That's not a happy ending at all. So I don't know where the whole sentimental talk is. But anyways, moving right along, we go into the next film in the Antoine Doinel series, and that is Stolen Kisses. And that came out in 1968. In fact, this film was dedicated to Henry Langlois, who is best known as the curator of and one of the co-founders of Cinémathèque Française, one of the earliest, most popular of film preservation efforts. and a very key figure in the life of the for the French New Wave, and particularly those critics who wrote for the Cahiers du Cinéma and who would eventually become filmmakers in their own right, like François Truffaut, like Jean-Luc Godard, like Eric Rohmer, and so on. The film was dedicated to him because at the time he was fired by the I forget his name, but he was the French Minister of Culture. He was fired by him, and thus the Cinémathèque Française was shut down. And so the film was dedicated to him. And this was released in '68. And if you know anything about French history, you also know what also happened in '68. So and actually, what's interesting is that there's some mild allusions to May '68 in the film. It's not overt. Certainly not on the level of Godard, the way that Godard would take it. Where pretty much after that event, it seems like everything he does can be traced back to May 1968, especially with his last commercial film, Weekend. And then the films that the kind of agitprop films he made in the 70s. It seems to all be informed by May '68. But here, it is referenced, but in a very, very mild way. And mostly just because of just the circumstance. I mean, Antoine Doinel is, while he was born lower class and pretty much stays more or less middle class, he does have a fascination with the bourgeois, and a lot of the women he tends to fall for tend to be more on the bourgeois side. So it's really just the environment that he's in, and also the interest. He's not overtly political. He's not totally interested in politics. He has other interests in mind, and so it's really just out of interest or lack of interest that you don't get the politics. It's not necessarily indifference, or maybe that is. Who knows? But anyway, so in other words, it's all part of the character. It's politics is not thrown in just for the sake of politics, which is why the allusions to May '68 is very mild. But anyways, Stolen Kisses. In his lifeline, he's 22, I believe. He has just finished his stint in the Army. And actually, he wasn't drafted in the Army. He actually volunteered. And he actually had one of the worst Army careers. He was absent without leave. He got into various problems with his superiors. As a result, he was dishonorably discharged from service, which meant which means his future employment prospects were very limited. If you're not honorably discharged in the Army, you can't hold a civil service job in France, and also major private firms wouldn't probably look favorably on you for employment. So basically, any kind of advancement you hope to seek, you're not going to get it. So anyway, that's how he starts, and he. And while he was in the Army, he had this relationship with why are people's names? And I watched this yesterday. This is bad, totally, completely bad form. Sabine, there we go. Wait, no, that's much later. Damn. Christine, there we go. I knew I was going to get it. Christine Darbon. He has this relationship with Christine, and of course this also extends to her family as well. And she is a violinist, and at that time she's still in the conservatory, so she's not a full player yet, but she's on her way. So he has a relationship with her, and it has reached there's kind of an uncertain spot of whether it's gonna mean something more, if it's going to fall apart. It's at an uncertain phase while he's trying to get his post-Army life together. And one of the things he ends up taking, and this is the other thing about Antoine, is that he has a variety. His career has been varied. He's taken on a lot of different jobs, and sometimes his jobs are very short-lived. In fact, he was hired for a night to be the night clerk, or to be the hotel clerk or the night porter, but he ended up getting fired because he, unbeknownst to him, he brought in a private detective and caused a rampage in the hotel. So that job didn't last very well. But actually, because of his acquaintance because he met this private detective, he got hired by this agency, by this private detective agency, and tries to work on that, and that ends up being complicated for all kinds of reasons. This one assignment he's in, he's assigned to help out this owner of a shoe store who believes that there's this conspiracy against him. Like, everybody doesn't like him. He perceives that everybody doesn't like him, and so he wants to know why. And it's one of those things where you look at him, you look at how he acts, and you look at how other people react, you think, you don't need to spend 2,000 francs to say why people don't like you. I mean, I could give that to you for free. But since you're giving me money, well, all right, I'm not gonna say no. But anyways, he's assigned to that. He ends up falling in love with his wife, played by Delphine Seyrig. She was in The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. She's going to show up in future films later. But at any rate, that just basically, again, this is what kind of characterizes a lot of his films. It's basically he makes all these different decisions, and he keeps making more choices that just compound and make things complicated and makes things really, really difficult for him. But it's all driven by some basic base desires, like the desire to prove himself, to make something of himself, to win over to win over certain hearts, and he's also very much a romantic, so there's that romantic zeal that comes through. Again, Balzac shows up. Of course, he doesn't have to. Of course, he doesn't have to write an essay for it. This just complicates his love life. So all these things come, and in the end, by the end of all these films, he ends up with Christine. They are engaged, and they are engaged to be married. And that's kind of how it ends. But at any rate, so that's Stolen Kisses. Then the next film is Bed and Board, released in 1970. And at this stage in Antoine's life, he's married to Christine. And you first see him, he's running a kind of flower shop where he has to dye flowers and sell them and such. And that's eventually going to get... He's probably done it for a while, but he's at the point where that's going to end. So employment was always a constant problem, but he's more or less settled with Christine, and she gives out violin lessons and so on. And then what ends up happening for him is two things. One, they're about to have a child. And so that happens. And then the other thing is that he ends up working for an upcoming firm that maritime construction. They make ports. And actually his job is to run, they have this model of the port in their office building, and his job is to run the boats in this port. Just in case people come by and see what this port is all about, they can see how it all goes into action. So yeah, not a lot of not a lot of brain power there. Now the funny thing is that it's set up that when he interviews for the job, part of he finds it in a want ad, and part of the want ad says that that you are a hard worker and smart and know English. And he had taught himself English through records, and actually this was a carryover from Stolen Kisses as a way to win over the shoe store owner's wife. So he knows some English, but it's set up that there's another guy who who's going for the position, and in fact he holds a recommendation letter that someone had written for him, saying that, oh, I highly recommend this guy. He was in the Scouts, and he was shown to be very exemplary. I think he'll be a great asset. So the guy who ends up hiring, who's responsible for the hiring, gets the letter first, and then Antoine gets called up, not the other guy. And then so the assumption is that the letter and Antoine are supposed to be the same people, although it's kind of clear that it's not. And I find it kind of amusing is that is set up while the job ends up being that he just controls these boats. So it kind of makes you wonder that maybe the job was not on the other guy's level. And this is the other thing about Truffaut. Going back to Truffaut. For Truffaut, one of his favorite filmmakers was Alfred Hitchcock. And the thing that you learn from Hitchcock is setups and payoffs. Is that you set up your plot, you have these little moments where things are set up, and then eventually they pay off. And Truffaut is really, really good at doing that. But I would also say, but I think the best, how you take that one step further, because setups and payoffs are all part of the plot. And if you have a good sense of knowing how to write a plot, you need to have that. But what takes it one step further, so that it's not just merely just setups and payoffs and just following along a plot line, is that if you imbue it with some nuance and some character, it makes it feel more real and less contrived. Because let's face it, writing things based on a plot is a contrivance. I mean, it automatically makes it a contrivance. What makes it feel less like a contrivance is that if there's a little bit of humanity to it. And that's where having characters with nuance and some complexities, while there are some basic traits, it's not as if they exercise those traits all the time. For instance, if you have a character that is known to be set up to be very selfish and self-centered, there may be a moment where he is not self-centered, where he does show some concern for somebody else, and that gives a character a little bit of depth and complexity. It's not just a one-note or one-dimensional or two-dimensional character. And that's what makes it interesting. The more complex a character is, the more you get into it and the more you believe it. And the more you get into the film. So it doesn't... So anyways, back to the film. So he gets hired by this firm, and one of the prospective clients, he ends up from Japan. He ends up inadvertently having this affair with her, and this, of course, strains the marriage, and it caused the first, eventually among many separations between Antoine and Christine, and it's. And in a way, in seeing this film, and by the way, it's been a while since I've seen any of the Antoine Doinel films. I watched all of them last night, and I can't remember the last time I saw all of them at once in that way. But in revisiting, in seeing Bed and Board, and this will also become apparent in the next film, he kind of reminds me a lot of Rob Fleming or Rob Gordon from High Fidelity, whether you've read the novel or seen the film. And one of the things that defines Rob's character is his fascination with the ideal woman. That he has this idea of a perfect woman, and he goes off and pursues it, and that's what leads him to go from, as he says in the film, to jump from rock to rock until there aren't any more rocks. and this whole thinking with your gut. And I've come to the conclusion that my guts have shit for brains. But Bed and Board, and then the next film, Love on the Run, that trait came through, or I made that connection when I saw is that Antoine Doinel was a kind of prototype to Rob Fleming or Rob Gordon, just constantly seeking, this constant chasing of the ideal, or idealizing women, or fashioning women in his own image, and so forth, and as opposed to looking at women on their own terms. And I think that's the other thing that makes Bed and Board really interesting, is that there is a emotional immaturity at play. And actually on both characters, certainly on Antoine, but also with Christine in some respects, which leads into some of the tensions. In a way, all of these films could be seen as playing with certain narrative film conventions. Like in this case, this Bed and Board is if 400 Blows is about the childhood, and Stolen Kiss and Antoine and Colette is a simple love story, and Stolen Kisses is another romantic comedy. Bed and Board looks at is a film about marriage, and in fact, one IMDb review title says, "This is Truffaut's Scenes from a Marriage," and I can see that. That this is a look at. So in other words, like the marital films, you see a marriage that is on the rocks, is really shaky, and it can go into one or two outcomes. Either the marriage eventually falls apart, or the marriage is saved because there's new life interjected, or there's a reforging that's better than the previous one. So it can go in one of those two ways. And so this is Truffaut's take on that convention, but it's all done on his terms. And that's why I think makes Truffaut very interesting in a certain respect. Even if you don't like the conventionality of his starting point, he at least made it interesting. It's not that he follows the conventions. It's that he sets he starts with the convention and then plays with it and adds some more to it to make it a little bit more interesting. So it's not just watching the same old film over and over again. There's some intrigue into it. So anyways, back to the film. In the end, he realizes that maybe I shouldn't pursue this. And the reason why I brought up Rob Gordon in the first place is because I think he was initially fascinated by something about this Kyoko is supposed to be her name. There's something fascinating about her, and then he eventually finds her boring. And this could be one or two ways: either that she embodies the ideal too well, or it's not what he thought she was ends up not being the case. Either way, it's a very immature way to start an affair, and it's certainly an immature way to end it. Actually, the whole thing is immature anyways. For me personally, fidelity is really important. And even if I'm in a relationship where I am dissatisfied, I don't break that fidelity. I'm in it unless it's not there. And if I wanted to pursue another relationship, I would end that one first before I go on to the next. I don't try to play the affair game. It's just stupid and ridiculous. So there's immaturity going all around, and in the end, there's kind of a there's a resolve, but there's also not a resolve, and perhaps this is to set up future films and such. And in the end, there is an initial reconciliation, but it doesn't solve all the problems that occur. There's just new problems that show up, which then leads into the last film, and that is Love on the Run, released in 1979. Now, of the Antoine Doinel films, this one gets a lot of flack, and mainly because of how it's all in the execution. This is the film where there are a lot of flashbacks to the other four. I would say that probably, I think maybe a third, I think easily a third of the film consists of flashbacks. And most of them were from the previous four Antoine Doinel films. So you see scenes from 400 Blows, you see scenes from Antoine and Colette, you see scenes from Stolen Kisses and Bed and Board. And it's that clip show feeling that can put off a lot of people, that does put off a lot of people. It's like, why are we it gives the impression that, oh, you just run out of ideas, you're just using what you've established before, and you're just being lazy, and you're just reusing it again. And I'll be honest, the first time I saw this, because I saw all the films sequentially in one go, seeing Love on the Run felt very weak, certainly because the other four films are still very fresh, and seeing this is like, why am I seeing this scene again? Why is this there? And it does make it feel like a very weaker film. But in the larger context, there was 9 years separating Bed and Board and Love on the Run. So in that context, it did feel, I would imagine it did feel a bit refreshing to go back to look back on 20 years of Truffaut's films and it is part of the character. I mean, these are all films that revolve around this character, and so they are very much a part of his life, and the past does inform a lot of his future decisions. So, in other words, the use of the flashbacks, I feel, are justified. It's not, it's not done out of laziness. It's not any of that. It's all done to illustrate a present moment in his life. And in this particular present moment is that, yes, Antoine, it's gotten to the point where Antoine and Christine do divorce. They've had separations, but now they're able to divorce, and it's because of a new divorce law that basically allows for it's the equivalent of the no-fault divorce in the United States. They had this in France, and Antoine and Christine are one of the first couples to divorce under this new law. So they're split up, and finally, and oh yeah, I mentioned in Bed and Board they had a son. They did have a child, and it was a son named Alphonse, much to the disappointment of Christine, who wanted to name him Ghislain, or Ghislain, I think is how you say it. Forgive me if I mispronounce it, but. So anyway, so that happens, and where he's at now, he works as a proofreader, and he's living with this woman Sabine, who works as a record store clerk. Speaking of high fidelity, and there's some uncertainty there, and okay, so yeah, he's divorced with Christine, he's living with Sabine, and actually the reason why the divorce happens, finally was able to happen, is because the last straw for Christine was, there was this weird affair that he has with one of her students, Lillian, and that caused a lot of strain, and then of course that relationship didn't work out because now he's with Sabine. And also, during the whole divorce affair, an old flame from his life, Colette, shows up, who is working as a lawyer, and so they get reacquainted. And also, at this point, he had published an autobiographical novel called The Troubles with Love, and I believe the title is La Saudade d'Amour. By the way, this is the supplement disc on the box set. So that's why I was able to recall that title. But anyways, and Colette sees this. After Colette sees Antoine, they hadn't spoken in years, she's motivated to get his book, and she reads it on the train, and actually kind of calls him out on some stuff. And and Antoine is perfectly within his right to either accept this at face value or just to completely ignore it, or just say that, what, all right, I hear you, but I'm not going to do anything about it. So, in a way, the film does sort of tie up some. It ties up some loose ends, and it also, I think, it gives a nice closure to the film. I mean, there are definitely worse ways you can close the series, and are there better ways to do it? Of course, but I don't know. I think it was probably the best way to close out the film. In the end, what ends up what the conclusion you kind of draw from it is that Antoine is basically just a perpetual man-child. He's always going to have issues with his parents. He's always going to have issues with women. But I think as long as he's in love and as long as he's living life, he's fine. And he sort of sees that in Sabine in the end, but I would also think that there was probably a point where he's going to fall in love with somebody else. So in a way, that's another reason why I thought of High Fidelity when in revisiting these films is Rob kind of comes through that same conclusion, and but at the same time I think Rob does more or less settle down, and maybe Antoine does also settle down in some respects, but I think there's also something in his nature that will give him that sort of perpetual restlessness, and he's just going to continue. He's going to continue jumping from rock to rock until there aren't any more rocks. So, oh well. I mean, but in a way that's what makes the whole series really interesting, is because this is a character that's created on its own terms. It's the creation of François Truffaut. It's played consistently by Jean-Pierre Léaud. So it's interesting to see him go from 12 years old to someone in his 30s. And to see this evolution of the filmmaker, of the actor, as well as the character, and the character does feel very genuine in a lot of respects. I mean, some things may be contrived, yes, because it's just the nature of filmmaking. But I also feel that it's not complete. It's not so contrived that it becomes unbelievable. That's why I say that this may be one of the few character franchises. And while I caught myself and said, yeah, there's James Bond, but James Bond is a fantastical character in his own right. I mean, if you were to actually do all the things that you've seen James Bond do in all the films that have ever been made in that character, it does veer into unbelievability, and that's one of the criticisms fairly consistent criticisms that have been made against James Bond is that this is fantastical adventure. Of course, other people would say that, well, that's kind of the point, and sometimes you do need that kind of escapist mindset. You want to have this exciting adventure, and James Bond is a vehicle for you to go on this exciting adventure. But for Antoine Doinel, this is a more real life character. He's dealing with real things. People have gone through inconsistent. There are people that have inconsistent work histories, that do kind of fumble and bumble through life, who've had difficulties in school, who've had difficulties in parents. In fact, much of the childhood parts of Antoine, they do come from Truffaut himself. He didn't live with his parents until after his grandmother died, and there was a rocky relationship. that he had with his parents. I don't know if it was taken to that extremes with as far as getting into juvenile centers, placed in juvenile centers, but certainly those sentiments were there. And going back to what I said much earlier, in other instances, I feel that with writers in creating characters, they can start with their own lives, but it's where you take those little aspects and how you play with them, and so that it goes beyond just yourself, that it can touch on something much larger, more universal. You know, going from the personal to the universal, as they say, as they can be said. So, and Truffaut did that with Antoine Doinel. So I think it's partly a reflection of his own past. It's partly a reflection of his own interests. I don't think that he was a fumbling, bumbling Romanizer, but I think there is something about Antoine that does embody sort of the spirit of cinema, in that there is sort of this relentless passion and drive that you can find in cinema, that you can also find in Antoine Doinel. It also goes back to that Michel Morlet quote, the cinema substitutes for our gaze a world more in accordance with our desires. And in a way, Antoine Doinel does embody that aspect of cinema, that notion of desire, and that what fuels him, what drives him ultimately is desire. And that's what leads him on these, again, that's what leads him on these little adventures. And I guess I'll conclude by saying that this is another example of Criterion's love of films. As you may have noticed, the packaging, as I'm putting all these back in the box, follows a particular theme. These are, as you see in the covers, these are all the shirts that Antoine is known to have worn in those particular films. Like in the case of 400 Blows, it's the black turtleneck, which is sort of close to what I'm wearing right now. And then all of these are supposed to fit into what looks like a personal suitcase. So, clever. But very befitting, because actually Antoine and Colette, he does pack his suitcase to move from one apartment to the next, so he can be close. So Antoine could be closer to Colette. So it all ties together. It all fits very well. So I would say that in the end, I mean, okay. So my recommendations. I would say that if you're definitely interested in, if you like films that are more about characters and you want to see how a character study works in cinema, definitely get the whole set. Having said that, you can't go wrong with getting 400 Blows. You can't go wrong with adding that to your shelf. It's a very, like I said, it's a landmark film. It's what helped. It's one of the films that helped launch the French New Wave. Other films being Breathless and Hiroshima Mon Amour. So it's influential in that respect. It's definitely a great example of how to depict childhood in film that's done in a very interesting way. So yeah, you can't go wrong with seeing 400 Blows. The only difference between getting 400 Blows on its own and 400 Blows in context to Antoine Doinel, the Antoine Doinel set, is that you don't get the short film Antoine and Colette, which I think to me makes sense because having that short, it does make sense in the context of his larger story. So if you're going to have one film, just have it be that one film. Don't try to further complicate it by adding something else. So the film on its own should be the film on its own. But as part of this set, it makes sense to have all of it. So there you go. Definitely check, at the very least, check out 400 Blows. But if you like the character, if you want to know more about his life, and like I said, an example of a character-driven franchise, definitely check out the whole set. So there you go. Antoine Doinel. And until next time, take care.